And the moment that we prioritize intent over impact, that means that we are just shutting ourselves off from continuing to be a good and well-intentioned person.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to 80% Mental, a podcast all about the psychology of sport and performance and health and well-being. And it's just about psychology and whatever I want to talk about, to be honest, these days. This series, we're kind of diving into the psychology of exercise and health and well-being. And I've got a brand new co-host helping me out this season, Leah. Leah Washington, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm all right. At time of recording, I'm fresh off a camping trip.
Yeah, I saw some of your pictures about the camping. You looked completely miserable. How was it?
It was completely miserable. It's not for me. I'm not an outdoorsy type.
Oh, I'm a full indoor cat for sure.
Yeah. It was like, do you want to sleep outside on a, bed made of air under some light canvas?
No.
In a sleeping bag?
Nope.
Several hundred yards away from, a toilet? No, not really. I mean, give me a hotel room.
1,000,000%.
I
do not understand it. My partner likes camping, and I'm like, oh, you have a great time, waving from the porch. Like, go ahead.
I'm willing to listen to what people have to say about it. And if anybody can tell me which bit is the fun bit,
I'm all ears.
I'm happy to listen. But as of yet, in 45 years, I haven't figured out which bit the fun bit is supposed to be.
Nope.
So we were waiting to bring the tent down as well the next morning. And it rained solidly for about 2 hours.
Gross.
Can we just leave the tent there? Forever?
Just abandon it.
Just abandon it? Yeah, I'm pretty sure we could do that. So anyway, I'm fresh off a camping trip. But the other thing is as well that I'm absolutely covered in bites, insect bites.
See, that's the other thing. No, thank you.
Like my hands are covered in them.
Absolutely not.
That's definitely not the fun bit. Anyway, camping side, we are here today to talk a little bit about cognitive biases. Now, anybody who is kind of into psychology or got into psychology probably did so because they were just interested in why people make the decisions that they make, why people behave in the way that they do, and cognitive biases, which we're going to get into in a little bit, kind of explain some of that stuff really interestingly. And we've got an expert, as usual, to help us out with this episode. I've already abandoned the thinking of a question for the title of the episode format. I can't be bothered.
That's fair.
I just can't be bothered. So I'm just going to call it cognitive biases because that's what it's about. People can figure it out. But to help us talk about cognitive biases, we have Chris Garrison with us. Chris, how are you doing?
Well, I'm one of those people that likes camping in select conditions.
Is the select condition a hotel?
It's a place where rain and mosquitoes are unlikely. So the desert is a great spot. Although I'm completely with you on, do not put me hundreds of yards away from a toilet. And especially don't put me hundreds of yards away from a toilet that men are also using.
Yeah. I mean, we could get into the toilet situation. They weren't bad when we first got there. By the time it got to the next morning,
yeah,
they weren't great.
I have a bias against communal toilets. There we go. Other than that, I'm great.
That's a reasonable bias.
That's a reasonable bias, yeah. Other than that, I'm doing very well. I am UK based, so I'm struggling a little bit with our lack of summer.
Yeah, it's freezing.
Yeah. So other than that, though, I am firing on almost all cylinders.
Awesome. Well, just to introduce you properly, Chris is the Director of Culturgen, which you can tell us a little bit about in a moment, and is a self-confessed behavioural science nerd.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, welcome to 80% Mental.
Pleasure to be here. Such a privilege. Thanks, Pete.
Tell us a little bit about your role before we get into this. So, Director of Culturgen, what's that involve?
So, yeah, it's a little boutique consultancy that effectively goes into various workplaces and helps people understand how behavior is impacting performance. And that sounds somewhat nerdy, but it is a little bit nerdy only because many of the things that happen to us in workplaces that make us feel certain things, either feel great about our jobs or feel anxiety about our jobs, are often related to the behaviors that we're experiencing from other people. And this is certainly what happened to me over the course of a very nonlinear career path. And so all I had coming out of various jobs were questions about, why was this happening to me? Why didn't people see my capability? Why did I keep getting put in a box? And then finally I started to learn about the answers to those questions. And ultimately it was much related to the sort of biases that do live in the minds of people and how that translates into behavior. And so now what I do is I go in and help people identify what those behaviors are and illustrate how they are impacting performance, and do so very much from the perspective that this is about enabling high performance in workplaces. It is not simply about sitting around a campfire and singing Kumbaya while making delicious s'mores, which I'm very good at, by the way, but that's not what we're talking about in terms of performance in the workplace. So that's what I do.
Okay. Interesting side note. There was a campfire. There was a person with a guitar singing songs. And when he sang Dancing in the Moonlight by Top Loader, it almost tipped me over the edge. I almost went homicidal. That was almost the end of the camping trip for everyone involved. But anyway, back to...
That's when I talk about performance in the workplace, I'm not talking about doing any of those things. Trust falls are not part of my portfolio.
Thank God. Anyway, it's just not for me. It's not for me. Loads of people like it, and that's fine. It's not for me. Anyway, cognitive biases. Let's get down to it. Can you explain to us, in as simple terms as possible, like what are cognitive biases?
I'm so glad you asked, Pete. I feel like we spend a lot of time talking about what biases are, and at the same time, I still think people don't quite have a very clear definition of them. We just know that they are a thing that exists. The best way to understand what they actually are is to think of them as cognitive illusions that occur under specific conditions. And then these conditions will act as a cue that causes our brain to go and retrieve a bunch of information. So, for example, Pete and Leah, if I asked you to finish this sentence, 8, 6, 7, 5.
4.
3.
2.
1. I like the way we did that.
Yeah, that's actually not the answer. So this is a good way to illustrate this. Most of the time when you think 8, 6, 7, 5, people say 309 because that's a song lyric. So the condition that I've given you is I've given you the start of a song lyric. And for many people, that acts as a cue where they go and retrieve the rest of the lyric, which is 8, 6, 7, 5, 309. And that's really what bias is in our mind. It is, we are exposed to some set of circumstances. That set of circumstances serves as a trigger for our brain to go and retrieve a bunch of information that it has stored in our brains over the course of a number of years. And that's pretty much what they are. It's not just something that happens to us. I think if I had one takeaway for people, it's that I want people to realize that we are not born with bias. It is a cognitive process that takes place over a number of years, starting as early as the age of 2 years old. Before we can even form complete sentences, the pathways that lead to bias in our brain are underway. But it also means that it is something that we can control. It's not something that we have to be overly burdened by. And I think that's the part of the conversation that often gets left out is, well, great, you're telling me all about bias, but what the hell am I supposed to do about it?
Yeah, we'll get into some of that a little bit later on. I've not heard it described that way before as cognitive illusions.
Yeah.
Where do they come from then? Like, what's the function?
So if we think of our brains as a big giant computer, then we can start to understand the sort of origin story of how bias happened in our brain and how it then goes on to function. And just like any computer, our brain has an operating system. And this is one of the unconscious parts of our brain. We can't actually control things like our renal function, our cardiac function, our respiratory rate. Like none of those things are within our control. And we know this because if we try and hold our breath, for example, at some point, our brain is going to be like, hey, what are you doing, you idiot? Take a breath, right? And so these are parts of our brain that sit in the operating system of our brain. And that's not the part that bias lives in. We can't access the operating system of our brain. We can't alter it in any way. But then as we get older, again, starting at about the age of 2 years old, our brain starts to acquire and store information in memory. And this process usually begins through sensory input. Information will come in through any one of a number of different sources, through our five senses. And when we're babies, this information lands primarily in short-term memory, and much of it gets lost because we don't yet have the cognitive capability to do anything with it and put it into long-term memory. And then all of a sudden, as we get a little bit older, we develop more cognitive ability, and the things that we get exposed to will become part of our long-term memory. And once things start to get stored in long-term memory, then we begin a process of categorization. The thing is, though, that we don't actually store information the same way as a computer does. What we do is we encode it, and then we categorize it as we pass it into our long-term memory. And we're taking in so much information at any given time that we couldn't possibly handle all of it without this encoding process. And so in order to navigate the world, our brain wants to simplify things. And one of the ways that we do that simplification is through creating categories of different things. And by categorizing information, it just means that it's a lot easier for our brain to recall things when we actually need to. And the thing about this encoding and categorizing process, though, is that it doesn't have any kind of a moral compass or a truth filter. It is simply taking in information and deciding that looks like it belongs with this other piece of information in this category, and so off it goes. And this is why we absolutely need our critical thinking skills, because it's critical thinking that allows us to separate fact from fiction. And this encoding process is not the thing that does that. And so the more often we get exposed to information, the more likely it is that we'll store it away in our long-term memory. And this is how bias ultimately starts to happen in our brain. The long and the short of it is that the things that we learn really early and get exposed to often will stick in our brains in perpetuity, and it will start to influence all of our decisions, and it will start to translate into our behaviors. But the problem is that when we don't apply any degree of scrutiny to it, then it is the thing that will happen at such a rapid pace that it means we will often have these things show up in decisions and behaviors without actually thinking about it. That was a really long-winded answer, and I hope somewhere in there was an answer to the actual question that you asked me.
Yeah, no, for sure. So Leah, this is kind of like the way that people will probably be most familiar with cognitive biases, from what Chris was saying there, the idea that we have so much information to process, and these biases are kind of just like shortcuts, mental shortcuts that can help us filter and process some of that information. I guess that's kind of what most people would understand by cognitive biases, right?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it really reads as like threat assessment, right? Mm-hmm. Like if I walk into a room, like, am I safe here? Who are these people? Do I know them? Are they like me, not like me? Are they, and it's kind of like a holdover from just like, oh, I walk into a room and it's my family, be like, cool, everybody's chill, or I know what to expect, right? And it's sort of like, in addition to this idea of threat assessment, it's sort of like, how can I predict what's going to happen? Given the scenario that I'm in, what am I assuming, right, about this context of how am I going to be able to behave? How am I going to be able to talk to these people? What are they going to say? So all of these shortcuts sort of like dictate a lot of behavior in this way, because it's what am I anticipating about to happen, and how safe do I feel in that general context?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It is all about perception, And then how we translate that perception into information retrieval, and then how that translates into the way that we think and behave. And it isn't always, Leah, just, I've walked into a room and I'm going to see what the outline of the room looks like. And, is there anybody else in the room that looks like me? This same process sits behind most of our preferences. And so when we talk about what do you do about bias, one thing to keep in mind is that we don't have to try and correct this process of how our brain takes in information and categorizes it and encodes it. Like I said, we need it to do that process. It's just about recognizing the specific situations where these cognitive illusions or biases might show up. And then we need to apply a little bit of slower thinking to how we actually go ahead and proceed in that situation. How are we going to show up in that situation? How is our behavior going to show up in that situation? But if the three of us are sitting around and somebody says, hey, we should get some pizza for lunch, I don't need to examine why I think putting pineapple on pizza is a terrible idea and an abomination. I just know that it's a terrible idea and an abomination. I don't want hot fruit on a pizza. But if you say, okay, we've got this task that we want to work on together, then I might need to think a little bit more carefully about, well, what is the way of working that how do I like to collaborate? How do you like to collaborate? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. And I think, that some examples might help here as well, because, there are some really, really well-known cognitive biases that I'm sure people will be familiar with if we kind of put it into context. I really like this definition of them being cognitive illusions that determine how we might behave in a given circumstance. And I think using that definition, highlighting some examples might be really useful. So, I mean, one of them that's really very, very prevalent in science. So a lot of our listeners will be familiar with the idea of confirmation bias. So very, very prevalent in science and in publishing and in flat earthers. Confirmation bias. Right. So can you tell us a little bit about confirmation bias and maybe how that might show up for someone?
Yeah. So basically, confirmation bias and a few other biases that are somewhat related to it are all based on what we decide is important information. And in the case of confirmation bias, we will often seek out things that confirm an idea that we already hold. So if I am a person that thinks that the earth is flat, then...
Which you are not, just to clarify.
Just to be perfectly clear, I am not a believer in flat earth. The earth is not flat, just for the record. But if I think that the earth is flat, then every piece of information that I look for that supports that idea is feeding into this bias that I have that the earth is flat. And the other side of that coin, of course, is that every piece of actual evidence that shows me that the earth is round is something that I will very easily dismiss. So confirmation bias is super, super common just because we like to be right. And being right helps to feed into this idea that we have of ourselves as intelligent and well-intentioned people. And there are lots and lots of biases that contribute to that same idea. And confirmation bias is one that you just see all the time. If I believe this thing, this piece of information validates my belief, I don't actually care about whether or not that piece of information itself is statistically reliable or evidence-based. All I care about is that it supports this idea that I have in my head, and that makes me feel like a super smart, intelligent, capable person.
Mm-hmm. But what's interesting there is that, again, there's a whole section of biases that are basically about us thinking that we're better than we actually are, right? So
that we're not the exception.
Right. So like I mean, and Chris, you'll be able to talk about this far more than I can, but things like the illusion of superiority, right? Feeling that we're just better than everybody else. False consensus effect, the tendency to think that more people agree with us than actually do. There's a whole sort of subsection of biases that are just about me thinking that I'm awesome. And we have a natural tendency to do that, right?
There's one of my favorites is the IKEA effect, which is where we place a higher value on things that we have a hand in building.
Right.
So if you go to IKEA and you pick up your 40-pound Malm bedside table and you put it together yourself, somehow that is worth more than some Charles Eames designed chair that you pay lots and lots of money for from a proper design store. So IKEA effect is a good example of that. There's also another one called Lake Wobegon effect, which is also this about the sense of superiority and the illusion of, don't we have a bunch of beautiful children around here? Our whole town is populated with nothing but beautiful children, which is clearly not true. But
Where the women are strong and the men are good looking.
Exactly. But my absolute favorite is the Dunning-Kruger effect. It is absolutely my favorite of all the biases that we know about, and it has a fascinating backstory. So Dunning and Kruger were the two researchers that came up with the idea. And according to legend and lore, they were listening to news. I think they were based at Carnegie Mellon University, which is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And they were hearing this news report about this bank robber that had been caught by the police in broad daylight. And for some reason, the bank robber, as he was being marched out of the bank in handcuffs, was saying, I don't understand how the camera could see me. I don't understand how the camera saw my face. I don't understand it. And everybody was a bit flummoxed by this, right? And so it turns out, this is just brilliant. And it turns out the perpetrator had been listening to something where somebody said, you can use lemon juice as invisible ink. And this guy thought that meant that if he put lemon juice on his face, that he would be invisible to CCTV cameras. And so he did that. And he went into this bank unmasked in broad daylight and could not figure out why he got caught, and he was so easily identified. And so Dunning and Kruger were like, what the hell? And we have to figure out what's going on here. And so they set to work on trying to understand what is the cognitive pitfall that this guy fell into that made him think, invisible ink, that must mean if I put it on my face, you can't see me. And the end result of that work was that they came up with this Dunning-Kruger effect, which is this idea that we will overestimate our sense of intellectual capability. And the other part of this that I really like about it is that for people who are, average intelligence, when they are faced with someone who is so fundamentally wrong, but sure of themselves at the same time, that the average intelligent person, I will start to question my own intelligence. Am I the idiot here? Because I know that this person is wrong. Clearly, the Earth is not flat, but they seem so convinced of their superiority in terms of what they understand about this that, maybe I'm the asshole. Maybe I'm the one who is in the wrong here. And so it's one of these biases that doesn't just impact the person who is sort of creating that idea of intellectual superiority in their mind. It also impacts the witness to what is actually tremendous fallacy on the part of another person. And it's one of those things that we see it around us all the time. But now that we've actually described what it is, people are probably going to notice it much more because, if you think of the average politician, you're probably witnessing some degree of Dunning-Kruger effect.
This is the 80% Mental podcast. I'm here with co-host Dr. Leah Washington and Chris Garrison, and we're talking about cognitive bias and how it shows up, what it is. We've talked about cognitive bias in terms of it being an illusion, a cognitive illusion that impacts on the way that we process all of the information that we receive and the mental shortcuts maybe that we take in order to basically make life easier. But there's loads of examples of cognitive biases that we're all aware of. So we've just been talking about confirmation bias, for example, the Dunning-Kruger effect. But I wonder, just before we kind of get into the second half of what we're going to talk about today, if we could just come up with a few more examples of these biases. Because again, anyone who's interested, I would recommend Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a really, really brilliant explainer, if you want, of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different biases in the way that we sort of think about the world. But again, there's some in there that people might recognize. So one that I'm very, very much guilty of succumbing to all the time is the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy is the fact that everything takes 3 times longer than you think it's going to. And I'm hit by that every single day, pretty much. But there's loads of examples. Chris, have you got any examples of cognitive biases that again people might recognize, just day-to-day stuff that impacts the way that we think about things?
I mean, yes, of course I do. Definitely the one that I like talking about the most is stereotype bias. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I put that at the top of my list is because it's one of those examples of 2 things that can be true at the same time. We can be both victims of stereotype bias and people that allow stereotype bias to show up in our own behavior at the same time. And it's also the one that I think when people are resistant to talking about bias and what to do about it, it's my gateway into that conversation with them, because I can simply say, well, what are the stereotypes that you know exist about you? Because we all know the stereotypes that exist about us. And so that one is, and I will get into as much detail as you want me to about that one. But I think the reason why I like that one so much is because you can make it so relative and subjective for an individual person. Mm-hmm. They will have experienced something in their life that was based on a stereotype about them. And the moment that you can help them recall that situation and how it actually made them feel, the moment you open the door to being able to say, well, this is why it's so important to notice the people that come into a room with you, or when you walk into the room, or how you walk through the world might not be the same as anybody else. And then it makes it super easy to say, how are you going to show up in the very next interaction that you have with somebody? Do you want them to feel the way you have felt in the past based on stereotypes? So that one, I spend a lot of time talking about stereotype bias just because it is just so common. It's everywhere. We see it all the time.
Well, let's get into that a little bit then, soon as you've brought it up. Let's talk about stereotypes.
Great. Where would you like me to begin? From the beginning?
What is a stereotype?
So a stereotype is effectively a generalized belief about the characteristics of an entire group or community of people, and then a perception that any member of that group or that community shares that same characteristics. These are not things that are true from any kind of an evidence-based position. Really easy example. I am an American by birth, and there are lots and lots of stereotypes that exist about Americans. We all love guns, clearly. Right now, it would appear that we are all a bunch of Trump supporters. We're all loud talkers. And so these are just some generalized things that people believe. And so, as a person that has lived outside of the US for 15 years now, I know that when people first hear my accent, that one of the things that they might think is true about me is that, oh, you're just going to be another loud American. And actually, I'm really social, but I'm extremely introverted. So I don't actually talk a lot. This podcast may not be the best evidence of that. But I'm certainly not a loud talker by any stretch of the imagination. So, but there's this generalized belief about what it is. And so that means that every single group or community of people on the planet has a set of stereotypes that exist about them. And if we think back to that process that I described, the way that it works is that we will hear a stereotype about a specific group of people. That goes into our short-term memory. If it gets reinforced, it gets encoded and categorized into our long-term memory. And then when we're prompted, it becomes part of the information that our brain goes and recalls for us about that category of people. So if Leah and I walk into a conference room, then one of the first things that we're probably doing is looking to see if there's any women in the room. And if there isn't, which is a lot of times the case, then we might start to worry about, well, do the men in the room, what have they just recalled about the presence of women in the room? Have they recalled that women are overly emotional? Have they recalled that we're motherly? Have they recalled, all of the other stereotypes that exist about women in general? We must be PMSing. If we speak too much, then we're over talking. If we challenge somebody, then we're bitchy. And these are all stereotypes that exist about specific groups of people. And so we all know the stereotypes that exist about us. We don't always think of the stereotypes that live in our head when it comes to other groups of people, though. But the moment that a nerd like me comes along and says, hey, what are the stereotypes that exist in the world about women? Or what are the stereotypes that exist in the world about Black people? All of a sudden, we can instantly recall all of the things that we have been programmed to know about people. And this doesn't mean that we believe them to be true. Mm-hmm. It just means that we have a catalog of information about specific groups of people, and it will show up sometimes when we're not really thinking about it.
And again, the important point here is that we all do this. We all have these stereotypes. And I do an EDI session for BASES, one of the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science. It's a session on bias, and one of the things I start by doing is getting people to do exactly what you just said. Like, think about all the stereotypes that whether you believe them or not, about Black men, and immediately things start popping into people's heads. And it's like, don't tell me what they are. I don't want to know. I just want you to think about what some of these stereotypes are that you might know. And that, a lot of them are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old. They're based on, things that were used to justify slavery, right? But 500 years later, 400, 500 years later, those stereotypes are still there.
Yeah.
They're still in people's heads. They're still in the backs of people's minds. Whether they're at the front of people's minds or not is, a different question. But those stereotypes persist. And like you say, whether we believe them or not, we all have them about all sorts of different groups of people.
Yeah.
Something that was interesting that you were talking about just then was, I believe you were talking about a stereotype threat, where the person who is sort of on the receiving end, is that the right way of saying it?
Yeah.
Can you explain a bit about a stereotype threat?
Yes. Stereotype threat is, it's kind of a form of self-sabotage, sadly. What it actually is because stereotype bias itself is so prevalent, and because we know the stereotypes that apply to other people, we also know the stereotypes that apply to various aspects of our own identity. So if I'm in an occupation like engineering, where I need to be good at science and math and engineering principles in general, and this stereotype exists, then I'm going to have in the back of my mind somewhere, what if people think that because of my gender identity, I can't actually be good at this job? And that's what stereotype threat is. It is a concern and an anxiety that people around me will believe the stereotypes about me to be true. And as a result of that anxiety, it impacts my actual ability to be great at my job, or whatever the task is that I care about being great at. And it's a truly fascinating thing that happens to us, because it's got kind of a sister reaction, which is what we call imposter syndrome. And both of these things are based on our own perception of what the people around us might actually think. There's one major distinction between stereotype threat and imposter syndrome. And that is that if I'm experiencing stereotype threat, I don't actually know if the people in the room believe that stereotype to be true about me. I just think that they might believe that it's true about me. And so that will freak me out a little bit. Whereas imposter syndrome, that sense of, I'm going to get found out, I'm going to be considered a fraud, is because you have experienced some behavior, likely bias-based behavior, in the past that has created this concern for you. And so one of them has a little bit of evidence that could have happened years and years ago. And stereotype threat, you haven't actually seen that people believe this about you. You just know that the stereotype exists, and you don't want to be the one that makes people think that it's true. And the problem with it is that it's not like it's just a little thing that creates a bit of anxiety for us, and we'll just have to stop being babies and push through it. It has prolonged and serious mental and physical health implications if it goes on long enough.
So when we have either stereotype, threat, or imposter syndrome, like, because a lot of these things we talk about, these cognitive illusions or biases, what we're ultimately talking about is how do they influence behavior,
Yeah.
right? And so when we're encountering this stereotype threat or the related, imposter syndrome, like what impact does that have on our own behavior and how we interact with the world?
So if we're worried about it, then it means we're effectively going to hold back. If I worry that if I challenge somebody in the room and I'm going to be perceived as over talking or any one of the other negative stereotypes that gets applied to women, then I'm not going to speak up. I'm going to withhold my insights and my ideas. I'm not going to ask questions, even if they need to be asked. And so effectively, I'm going into self-preservation mode. And especially in workplaces, the reason why this is so problematic is that we will choose self-preservation even when we know that the information that we need to share or the question that we need to ask is vital for our colleagues or our customers or our performance as a whole. I will simply not expose myself to the risk of proving a stereotype to be true in somebody else's mind. So I won't speak up.
Well, and it can hurt the organization too, right? Like if you're sitting in a room and you want to ask the question of like, wait a second, like this doesn't seem right. Like a lot of times we anticipate or we actually get the like, well, you're just lucky to be here.
Yeah.
Right. So, and we see this a lot, especially in the professionalization of women's sports. There has recently, within past week or so, a lot of things have come out about a particular soccer team, right, and the abuses that have happened by their general manager, who has long been known for creating really toxic environments. And it wasn't, and there's a lot of times it's like, well, you're just lucky to have a league, you're lucky to have a team, you're lucky to even be here. So why would you even question it, right? And so those environments get to persist. Right. Yeah. Because we are so afraid to ask the question, right? Because we don't, again, want to be the one that sticks out. We don't want to be the one that ruffles feathers. We don't want to cause waves. We just want to I just want to go and I want to play my game, right? I just want to go and I want to do my thing. Because you also know the system is going to perpetuate. And so you perceive that threat personally.
Absolutely. And what you're describing is effectively what happens in the absence of psychological safety. If I'm in an environment where I feel like I cannot speak up or I can't challenge, then it enables all kinds of terrible things, right? And we just have a litany of things historically that point to this absence of psychological safety. And the thing that is driving the inability for us to do that is often the behavior that we see showing up, as you mentioned. And what sits behind that behavior is, well, in any one of a number of instances, it's probably being driven by bias.
I don't want to be the emotional one. I don't want to be the loudmouth. I don't want to be the one, right? Like all of these gendered biases of like, oh, well, you're just emotional about it, right?
Yeah. And that's the bias, right? It's
right.
If Pete thinks that you and I have spent too much time talking now, the little women can go ahead and put a cork in it because you all have over talked. You've spent enough time talking. Well, the bias in the room is Pete's belief that, yeah, if women talk too much, then they're over talking and they need to be shut down. And if that behavior comes out, if Pete says, the two of you, I think we've heard enough from you now, we need to go hear from other people. And what he means is we need to go hear from the men in the room and I really want to hear what you have to say. I'm not going to be like, oh, hang on a second. I would like to have Leah finish her thought, please, because I thought that was really valuable information. I'm not going to say anything.
And ultimately becomes like, I'm afraid to perpetuate the bias of my gender.
Yeah. I don't, and that's the stereotype threat piece. Well, I don't, if I say to Pete, hang on a second, Pete, I really want to hear the rest of Leah's thought. Even if I use that tone of voice, if I'm measured, if I'm not popping off at him and saying, you shut up, if I sound exactly like everybody else in the room, there is still a risk that I will be proving the stereotype to be true in the mind of somebody who thinks that women have talked enough now. So I won't say it. Even if I mimic my own behavior to reflect everything else that's coming from people who don't look like me and has already been accepted, I will not expose myself to that risk. I will prioritize that self-preservation over wanting to hear something from you that I know is vital for everybody in the room to hear.
This really great TikTok came across my For You page recently, and it was about imposter syndrome. And this person was like, what I've recently realized is like, either I actually am smart and have friends and all of these things, or I'm so clever at tricking all of these people to believe that I'm smart and have friends. I'm winning either way.
Exactly right.
This is genius. It's like, either I am those things for real, or I'm like the ultimate mastermind.
Absolutely true. So, Leah, you brought up imposter syndrome again, and I think if we can demonstrate the sort of full circle nature of how bias works, because as I mentioned, imposter syndrome is another one of these forms of self-sabotage that we do, but very often it is a result of an absence of affinity that we experience from people, especially in a workplace context. And the workplace could be the locker room, right? It doesn't just have to be people sitting around in cubicles as well. And I see this in my work all of the time. And this is why the impact of bias can be so terrible on people. So there's effectively 9 different kinds of bias that fall under this umbrella category of affinity biases. And what they all have in common is this idea of things that are familiar to us or similar to us are things that are easier for us to like or enjoy. And so we would gravitate towards things that are like us or familiar to us. And what happens is that that familiarity piece means that we will prefer that familiarity to things that are unfamiliar. So if you imagine this in like a workplace setting, it means that if I know Pete better than I know you, Leah, and I have some project coming up, that my familiarity means that I'm probably going to go to Pete to say, hey, let's work on this together, even if you're the one that actually has the requisite skill that I need for that project. Now, one of the other ways that this plays out, if I don't know somebody very well on my team and they make a mistake, I am more than likely not going to give them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to making that mistake. So in my example, if Pete is the one that I'm more familiar with and he makes a mistake, I'm probably going to be like, you know what, Pete, no sweat, man. Let's water under the bridge. Better luck next time. You'll get it right. And if Leah is the person who I'm less familiar with and she makes the exact same mistake, there's this bias means that I am more likely to stick her in time, which means that nothing that she does from that moment forward is necessarily going to correct the mistake that she's made in my eyes. And it doesn't matter how great her performance is after that. All I remember is that she made that one mistake. And even if it was the same mistake that you made, Pete, I'm still not going to give her the benefit of the doubt. And you can imagine how detrimental this is on the person who is on the receiving end of this particular kind of bias. And this is the kind of thing that can then lead to imposter syndrome. And I've had people say, this happened to me 20 years ago. And so if people are experiencing imposter syndrome, it's not always because of something that just happened to you yesterday. And in many cases, it can be because of something that happened to you decades ago.
And that's also where like stereotypes come into play, right? And how we attribute behavior in other people, right? We have this attribution bias of like, well, that person did that because they belong to this group of people and those are bad people. Or they did that because they're a bad person. I did the same exact thing, but I had really good reasons to do it.
This is like a fundamental attribution error, right? This is the idea that we overestimate how much someone's personality is responsible for their decision making, whereas my decision making is based on logic and reason, and your decisions are just because it's you, the person that you are.
Yeah.
And again, these affinity biases and these attribution errors, these are things that we all do, and we do them all the time. We prefer people that look like us, that sound like us, that are from the same place as us, that are the same gender as us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yep.
And it's, I guess, the awareness of that, which we'll get into a little bit later on, that is perhaps the most important thing, and maybe overcoming some or overriding some of these things that are just perfectly natural things for us to do.
Yeah. We've all received the same kind of cognitive programming. We all likely have the same category of information stored in our brain, and we will see the same cue, and it will go and retrieve that information. And so we're all equally capable of having this stuff show up in our behavior as everybody else. But it would be a mistake to think that that is unconscious bias, because it's just not how it works.
You're listening to the 80% Mental Podcast. I'm Dr. Pete Olusoga. I'm here with Leah Washington and Chris Garrison. And we're talking about cognitive biases. Biases? Biases? I don't know. If you're enjoying what you're listening to, then don't forget to subscribe at 80percentmental.com or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at EPM Podcast or on Instagram at 80percentmental. But let us know what you think. Let us know what your favorite cognitive bias is. We've all got one. And leave a comment on the episode. Chris, it's about that time in the podcast where we sort of take a little veer away from the topic and get to know our guest a little bit more. And I don't know if you've heard any of our recent episodes. I don't know if you're a fan. But I have 4 categories of questions for you to choose from. Although you don't get to choose. It's not a free choice. No, it is a free choice. It's just that you don't know what the choices are.
Yeah.
Wow, I really messed that up. So we've got...
It's the illusion of choice.
The illusion of choice, right. So we've got deep and meaningful, either or, the last time, or have you ever, right? Now I'm going to get you to choose a category, but you don't... What am I talking about? You're going to choose a number between 1 and 4. And that's going to tell me with my little virtual set of envelopes which set of questions you're going to get. First of all, are you up for playing?
Hell yeah, let's go.
First thing I'll do there, Chris, if you can choose a number between 1 and 4.
2.
2, okay. So we've got either or either or, depending on where you're from. So a series of questions, fairly quick fire questions, and we'll just see where we go with it. Okay. So let's start. So first one, football or basketball?
Basketball.
And okay, I was going to specify American football then, but it's basketball straight away. So.
Yeah, I love American football, but I was a basketball player until my knees effectively said nah.
Yeah, I'm right there with you on that. Leah, hockey's not an option. What are you going to do?
Oh, fuck. I'm going to go football, either American football or British football.
I'm personally hurt that you would take either of those over basketball.
Well, that is because I have a deep-seated bias against you.
Fair enough. So while we're on basketball, just in a really, really tenuous link back to biases, Michael Jordan or LeBron James?
Michael Jordan. It's not a debate. It's Michael Jordan.
So my theory is that there are lots of cognitive biases at play here as to why Michael Jordan is the greatest of all time. So
agreed.
One of them,
and they don't require scrutiny, Pete.
No, I mean, it's objectively, he's the greatest of all time. But there's a couple of things that are going on here, which is why I think we get these debates, right? And they're generational. So somebody who's my age will always say that Michael Jordan is the greatest of all time because of an availability heuristic. Right. Yep. So I am much more likely to be able to recall instances of Michael Jordan playing because I grew up in that era. I watched him play. I can recall, I can imagine specific plays, specific games. They come easily to mind, right? It's an availability heuristic. There's also something called a reminiscence bump, right? Which is I'm much more likely to recall events from my sort of adolescent to early 20s years because it's a huge time of development for anybody, right? So all of those experiences come much more readily to mind. Now, obviously, during that age, I was watching Michael Jordan be awesome. Whereas somebody else, their reminiscence bump would be around the time that Kobe Bryant was playing or around the time that Bill Russell was playing. So I feel like and again, in a really tenuous link back to biases, there's cognitive biases at play here in this debate of who's the greatest of all time.
Yeah. There's another bias at work in that question, Pete, which is that why is it that we're only ever talking about men as being the greatest basketball player of all time? Why are we not talking about Cheryl Swoops? Why are we not talking about Teresa Weatherspoon? Why are we not talking about Sue Bird? And this touches on one of my personal pet peeves, which is when we use the word female in front of things. Best female athlete.
Oh my God. I can't.
Yeah.
Also, the use of female as a noun.
Yeah, it's sorry. If it's a female doctor, it's just a doctor. Anyway, you're right. And the other bias that, again, the confirmation bias comes back into it as well. I feel more validated that you also agree that Michael Jordan is the best basketball player of all time.
Best men's basketball player of all time.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Andy Murray. Best men's basketball player of all time. So again, there's a massive Venn diagram of how biases overlap with each other for sure.
Are we going to talk about recency bias, and we're going to leave out Babe Dietrichson-Saharius?
Yeah.
Yes, we are. We're absolutely going to.
Absolutely, we are. Yeah, because I've never heard of them.
She played baseball. Her name was Babe because everybody said she hit the ball like Babe Ruth, and she founded the LPGA. So.
Yeah, I just want to stop you there, Lisa. Lisa, what the fuck?
What the fuck?
There's a cue and a recall that went wrong.
I just want to stop you there, Leah. First of all, I'm going to edit out that bit where I just called you Lisa. Second of all, baseball's not really a sport, so it doesn't count. Chris, leader or follower?
Leader.
Leah, what would you say?
I honestly kind of hate being a leader. I've always been like a behind the scenes person.
Yeah. So
I don't know that I would necessarily categorize myself as a follower, but like I don't like to be the one in charge, actually. I like to be the second in command.
Big party or small gathering?
Small gathering.
Small gathering.
Yeah, same. Just not camping. Postcard or souvenir?
Oh, I do love some tchotchkes.
Some what?
Tchotchkes. It's a...
What the hell?
Are you unfamiliar with the term tchotchkes?
Oh.
Clearly.
That makes me a little Meshuggah, Pete.
Please explain.
It's like a knick-knack.
It's a Yiddish word for a souvenir.
Okay.
Like the little things that you have around your house.
Yeah, so I've got some tchotchkes here for you. They're all Star Wars or cartoon related.
Well, I was going to say, what's your what's the word? Sorry,
tchotchke.
Kachki.
No,
Tchotchke.
Tchotchke.
Okay, this isn't helping because I've already forgotten what the first letters were when you're spelling it out.
Well, it's also a transliteration. Like it doesn't even. It's like not even an English word.
So what's your tchotchke of choice?
It's probably it's either my Mandalorian Funko Pop, or it's the one behind it that John got me, which is it's my own custom Star Wars Funko Pop.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's got my name on the box and everything.
I like it.
Oh, that's so fancy.
Yeah.
Yeah. TV shows or movies?
Oh man, that's a tough one. I think I'm going to go movies only because all of the Anchorman quotes that I know just instantly pops into my head, and I can't say that I have that encyclopedic recall when it comes to TV shows.
Fair enough. What's your latest movie that you liked?
Listen, I was a late adopter to Barbie, but I think that the overall undertone and not so subtle messaging about social justice was. Yes.
I haven't. I have to say I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, Pete, get on board.
But I haven't seen Oppenheimer either, so I don't feel bad.
I haven't seen Oppenheimer.
Leah, TV shows or movies?
I have to go movie. I think because I love a documentary, but I also feel like a lot of like Netflixy kind of things have like sort of blurred the lines because like a lot of the documentaries are like 4-part documentaries. And so like, is that a TV show or is it just a movie that you've watched in 4 pieces? So yeah, I'm a documentary girl. So I'm going to go with that.
Fair enough. Sing or dance?
Dance. Not necessarily in public, though. I believe that I'm a better dancer than I actually am.
I think as do most people. Last one. Train ride or bike ride?
Oh, this is not fair. I worked in cycling for a decade.
I love a train.
Do you? I mean, you have about four train journeys in America, though, right?
Yeah, and they're never on time.
But
you don't exactly have a right.
I think I'm going to go bike ride. I really love an electric bike. They're so fun.
Is that not cheating?
Beg your pardon. You still have, have to work. Don't be fooled by the Deliveroo guys buzzing.
It was a question, not a statement.
No, I think it was a judgment. That's what I think. There's a tone. It's not cheating. It's electric assist.
Okay. I'll give you that one in my role as all-seeing, all-knowing, omnipotent podcast host. All right. Well, thank you.
Omnipotent, omnipresent.
Thank you, Chris, for playing our Getting to Know You game. I feel like I've got to know you a little bit better. So I appreciate you playing.
Avoiding those affinity biases.
All right. Back to what we're here to talk about then. We just sort of finished up a little bit earlier by talking about affinity biases. And we talked about some of the perhaps negative impacts that holding biases or holding on to biases, I guess, can have. And I want to talk about something that is very, very prevalent, especially probably in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, within organizations, whether they're sport organizations or kind of outside the sporting world. And we've sort of latched on to this idea of unconscious bias, right? And these are
four-letter word.
Yeah, these are the opinions, the biases that we've been talking about that we are supposedly unaware with. And they're measured, like, interestingly, they're measured with something called the implicit associations test, which has come out of Harvard. This is about how quick we are to link positive and negative words with different categories of people, to kind of simplify it. I've got some issues with the test itself. I'm going to hold on to those issues myself because you're the guest and I want you to talk about this. But if people are interested, they can actually have a go at doing this, right? You can just search implicit associations test Harvard and you can have a go at doing this test, measuring, and I'm doing air quotes here, your unconscious, and I'm doing more air quotes here, bias. So yeah, I'd have a go at it, see what you think. I'd kind of recommend that people do that before they sort of make a judgment. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, Chris, on this notion of unconscious bias. Again, I have my own thoughts. I'm sure Leah has her thoughts. I want to hear from you.
Well, Pete, I had a feeling that you were going to ask me this question. And so while I was making my tea this morning, I was considering whether or not I was going to lead with my overwhelmingly controversial statement or if I was going to gently get to it. And I think in the interest of Star Wars, I'm going to be a rebel and I'm going to say the most controversial thing that I can say about unconscious bias, which is that it is not real. It's not.
See, I don't think that's necessarily controversial.
Oh, good. Okay, good. The unconscious.
Go ahead.
Yeah, the unconscious is obviously very real. I talked about it earlier. It is where the operating system of our brain lives, and we don't want to have conscious control over that because we wouldn't know how to wield that power properly, right? So the unconscious is a very real thing, and we've just spent a whole bunch of time talking about how real bias is. But the term unconscious bias was a product of U.S. diversity and inclusion HR professionals who unfortunately kind of took two things that are very real and tried to make a real thing out of them. And I sympathize with how the term came about, right? Like they were trying to make sense of some of the behaviors that we know show up in various situations. The challenge I have with it is that it gives people an excuse for the way that bias shows up in their behavior. And one of the super common ways that we hear this manifest is when people say, oh, it's, this is just how I was raised. And that suggests that we have no control over our biases. And as I mentioned before, you said you have some criticisms of the Harvard IAT, and I do as well. What I think the IAT is really good at is measuring how quickly we recall information from our long-term memory. There's the cue. The cue is the picture of the person or the word, and here's how quickly I can associate something in my brain with whatever it is that I'm looking at on the screen. But I don't think that is the most accurate way to understand the mechanism of bias and how it works. And it certainly doesn't help us understand what to do about it. Mm-hmm. I don't think we need to qualify what bias is. It is just bias. It doesn't need to have a qualifier in front of it. And if we do insist on making some sort of qualification about bias, then we can call it implicit, or we can call it non-conscious, which is not the same thing as the unconscious, if you really want to get picky about it. But why don't we just call it bias? And the thing that the excuse making that it enables, I find that really amusing, because how much do we spend time thinking about, you can't be thought police, you can't, don't be politically correct. We have all of this pushback to people who are reasonably trying to influence how we think, and we interpret that as you're trying to control my thoughts. And yet, we're perfectly happy to suggest that there's this thought process that goes on in our brain over which we have zero control and influence.
Well, I think also, it only goes in one direction often, right? Yeah. It's always oh, well, he grew up in a different time, so and it's well, so did I. So why don't I get the same thing? Why don't you just be oh, well, she was raised today, so she's clearly going to be, have more acceptance towards gay people than, your racist uncle, whatever, that it always goes to excuse behavior that's maybe less desirable, but it doesn't go the other direction. It's
yeah, exactly. And that's ageism, right? It's oh, you grew up they're of a certain age, all that's actually ageism.
Right.
And it's actually not true. And the best example that I can give you of just, you can disprove that really quickly, is that we are all walking around with a device in our hand that is more powerful than NASA's first computer. Right. And when my parents, big crossworders, right? They love doing crossword puzzles, and they would fight over the paper in the morning because they would only get one paper for some strange reason that I still don't know. And then the iPad came out. And I bought my parents the very first version of the iPad, and I put the New York Times crossword app on it. And they're what is this weird and unusual thing that we have never seen before, because we're part of the greatest generation and this didn't exist. And I'm well, it does all kinds of things, but really what I want you to know about it is that you can do crosswords all day long, and you can take turns using it and never do the same crossword twice. And they instantly learned how to use the iPad. And then the next version came out with the camera. And this was, I don't know, 3 years later or whatever it was. And I bought my parents the one that had the camera in it. And then I took it to them and I said, okay, so you got this one. This still works. Nothing wrong with it. But I also want you to have this one. And my parents were why have you given us this new thing that never existed in our entire lifetimes? And we just learned how to use this other one. And now you're giving us this thing. And all I said to them was, well, with this one, when I call you now, you'll actually be able to see my face. And they were old iPad, out the door. Give us the new one, right? And so the moral of the story is that we will change our behavior when it matters enough. And it mattered enough for my parents to learn how to use the first iPad because they didn't have to fight over crosswords. It mattered enough to them to learn how to use the second one because it meant that they could see my face when I called them. Mm-hmm. And so this is why, how does this link back to unconscious bias? Well, this is why we should stop thinking that we don't have any control over our bias and how it leads to behavior. And it's also one of the keys to understanding what we do about bias. We first just have to realize that we need to decide that things are important enough for us to consider changing our behavior and how we interact with others. And that making that change doesn't somehow mean that this whole time we've been terrible people. And we just see so many examples of this, how swiftly society can move when it matters enough, and why the super tanker analogy that people often use is so terrible. It's really just a way to shut people up.
So is this the idea of kind of the turning circle of a super tanker is really big, and it takes a long time to turn the ship around, basically?
It takes huge amounts of time. And it leads into this false idea that you should just be happy with the progress that's been made. It's a way to silence attempts to change or progress or make improvements. And it links back to status quo bias. I'm super comfortable with the way things are right now. And I happen to think that if anything changes, that it's a zero-sum thing. Like, I'm automatically going to lose all of my power and my privilege if I somehow make it easier or more accessible for people to have things that they have traditionally not always had access to. And it isn't a zero-sum game. And this is another narrative, this offshoot of unconscious bias is, well, if I somehow learn how to be less biased, then it means I'm going to have to give up something that I have benefited from. And it's just fundamentally not true.
Well, I think, there are lots of criticisms of unconscious bias training.
Mm-hmm.
The Equality and Human Rights Commission wrote a report on unconscious bias training a few years ago. And I'll just say a few years ago to keep it vague so that it doesn't matter when the podcast comes out. But it can be useful for raising awareness. That's one of the things that they found, unconscious bias training. I know everyone's rolling their eyes, but I know. But like one of the problems with it is that first of all, it doesn't explore in any way why people actually hold these biases in the first place. Like, where does it come from?
Yeah.
Like, where do these stereotypes come from, for example? It doesn't actually do anything to change behavior, which is exactly what you were talking about there, Chris. And again, bringing another cognitive bias in here, the backfire effect, all right? Just highlighting different stereotypes might actually lead to them becoming more entrenched rather than less. But the big thing for me is that it absolutely downplays the existence and the role of real, conscious, deliberate bias. And, I was looking at the news today, and in the last 6 months or so in the UK, anti-Muslim hate, for example, has tripled. It's tripled. Muslim women are targeted in 2 out of every 3 incidents that are recorded over the last 6 months. There's nothing unconscious about that.
Nope.
There's nothing unconscious about that. There are very real biases, prejudices, stereotypes that people have with significant consequences that are absolutely conscious and deliberate. And this idea of it's unconscious bias, it's just nonsense. It's absolute bollocks. And I'm glad that you said that before I did.
Yeah. And I, to allude to something that I said earlier about how the point of this is not that we need to change every single bias that we have. I don't need to worry about changing my mind about pineapple on pizza, because really the only person that is impacted by that is me, or maybe the 3 of us if we were in the same room, and if you ordered it, I'm not having any. I'm not sharing any of my pineapple-free pizza.
I mean, this is a big deal for you, this pineapple on pizza thing. I feel like this is...
I love
think it's a worthy hill to die on. I just want to say that...
I love pineapple. I love
pineapple. Is delicious.
Yeah.
Warm pineapple.
Gross.
No.
Gross.
I wouldn't choose it, but I'd eat it.
No.
I mean... partly I would eat it because there's a pizza in front of me. So,
Well, then we do that thing where we apply the name Hawaiian to it, and I'm pretty sure it's not even cultural appropriation. That's just bastardization of an entire population of people. Anyway, we digress. The point that I was making was that we don't have to try and sit there and think every single... First of all, we're not going to figure out what all of our biases are, and that's not the mission. The mission is to simply recognize those situations where bias might be turning into some behavior of my own, and slowing my thinking down to try and make sure that I don't allow it to show up. And you're absolutely right that if somebody is making a decision, like imagine the number of steps that somebody has to go through in a short period of time to decide that they are going to verbally or physically abuse somebody else based on some aspect of their identity. Even if they're not connected to the full decision-making process that's taking place in their brain, they are still translating a fleeting thought into some kind of an action. And it's when bias goes from being just a thing that lives in our brain to something that turns into a decision or an action that we take that it can become problematic.
And not even just problematic, but it can be really dangerous, right? Like I deal with a lot of healthcare professions, and there is a lot of bias towards patients.
Yeah.
Right. Even, and there's studies very recently of like held beliefs, right, of healthcare professions of what they think about and believe about their patients.
Yeah.
And who gets treatment and who doesn't, and who gets the correct treatment. Is my patient, who is a woman, is she actually in pain, or does she have anxiety, right? There was a really interesting, I follow a bunch of physicians on Twitter, and one was like, how many times do I see a patient where the guy is like, well, I didn't think it was a big deal, but my wife made me come in. And he's like, if your wife makes you come in, you should believe it, right? Because they know what's going on. And then somebody else chimed in. It's like, yeah, but when we're actually the patient, you don't believe us.
Yeah. And God help you if you're a Black woman, right? Because you're even less likely to be in, air quotes, real pain. And this is why, mortality rates during childbirth are so much worse for Black women than they are for white women. And it is all underscored by what our perceptions are, stereotypes, generalized beliefs about the characteristics of an entire group of people. And that then translates to patient care in lots of
five times. Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. So this is the very real impact, the very, very, very real impact of some of these biases. So Chris, let's finish up then, and go from the sort of very real impact of some of these things to what we can do about it, right? So if there are issues with unconscious bias training, what can we do? How can we be more aware? How can we override our own biases? You talked there a little bit about slowing down thinking, and why is it important for us to do that?
It's important for us to do it because I think something that I said earlier, we have all been victims of biased behavior at some point in our lives. And we may not necessarily be able to say, oh, well, I can tell you that was specifically because of this kind of bias that led to that behavior in the first place. We're really pretty aware of how we feel in certain situations. And so because it's a case of we have all been victims of bias ourselves, this is probably the number one reason why I'd say it's important for us to be vigilant about how bias shows up in our own behaviors and how it influences our decision making, because we've all been on the receiving end of it and it feels pretty shitty, right? It feels terrible.
Yeah.
The challenge though is that none of us can give somebody a simple to-do list for how to guard against your biases. The objective is to not be bias-free. So unfortunately, that means that there is a little bit of effort that's required on our part in order to know how to guard against the sort of more problematic ways that these shortcuts, these biases can show up in our behaviors and our decision-making. But fortunately, the single best way to keep bias in check is to simply be able to recognize those situations and circumstances where bias might show up. And then when we find ourselves in that situation, it means we have to slow our thinking down. And you mentioned thinking fast and slow earlier, which is absolutely, it is the thing that opened my brain up to this in the first place and made me hungry to learn everything I possibly could. And in that book, the way Kahneman describes how we think, is we have this fast thinking part of our brain, which is the super quick recalling of information. We need it to function that way. It's kind of like a copywriter. It's just going, it's like an automatic light switch. It's on all the time. And then we have this slower thinking side of our brain, which is more like a light switch that we have to flip on. It's like an editor. So it can influence the fast thinking part of our brain, but it doesn't have total control over it. Mm-hmm. And it's often the faster thinking part of our brain, which is the lightning quick chain of events that goes from cue to recall to action. And so the easiest example is if I meet somebody for the first time, the very first thing that I'm doing is I'm looking for any kind of visual cue about that person's identity. If it was you and me, Pete, and we had never met before and I didn't know who you were and we met, the very first thing that would clearly jump out at me is that you are a Black man. And that is recognizing that we are now in a situation where bias might show up in my actions or my decision making or my behavior. And so at a minimum, I'm just going to be like, whoa, okay. This is a person who shares a different identity than mine. He has likely experienced lots of things in his life that I have never had to experience, nor will I. All I need to do is make sure that my behavior doesn't reflect some of the negative experiences that he may have had in the past. And so I'm not going to say, oh, hey, Pete, where are you from? And have you say, I'm from the north of England. And I'm not going to follow that up with, no. I mean, where are you really from? Because that's the bias running amok. And my thinking is too fast because what has just happened is you've given me an answer that I can't, it doesn't match the category of information of what somebody from here looks like. Right. So that's it. It's just recognizing I'm in a situation where there is a potential that if I allow my thinking to go too quick, that somehow bias is going to show up in that interaction in a way that I don't want it to. And it's going to be a thing that makes somebody else have to feel like they have to challenge me, which means that I must be a bad person, which is not true, right? So this is a cascade of events. So that's the first thing. Recognize the situations that we're in where bias may have too much influence over your decision-making process and your actions. The second thing is, if you're not sure, like I think maybe my decision-making is flawed here in some way, then ask somebody to play the role of a critical friend. And this isn't about somebody intentionally disagreeing with you. It could be somebody who absolutely agrees with you, but their job is to examine where in your decision-making process or in your behavior something may have been overly influenced by bias. So let's say, to use my same example, the three of us got together and I did the where are you really from question, and Leah was my critical friend. And I could tell that you bristled at that and something like just went off, but I couldn't really figure out what. And if I said to Leah, I feel like something that I said to Pete may have not gone over as well as I wanted it to. Did you hear me say anything? She might be like, oh yeah, you did the second question. You asked him where he's really from. Oh, you're right. And of course, that locked box that I referred to, that view of myself as a good and well-intentioned person, it would be really easy for me to like, oh, I didn't mean it that way, because I feel like you're telling me I'm a bad person. And we have to stop ourselves from thinking that somebody who is challenging our behavior or a process of decision-making is also saying to us that we're bad people, because that's not what they're saying.
Well, that kind of goes into like the idea of like, to me, when I think of like cognitive biases, all of us are, a lot of what we do is help people change behavior, right? That part of that is addressing the cognitive bias by creating cognitive dissonance.
Exactly.
Right? And so when you can say like, that second question was like, that was a little dicey. And you're like, well, that's not what I meant. Okay, well, you have this belief about yourself that you are not racist, but you asked this question, which I'm not saying that maybe you are racist, but like if you want to work towards being anti-racist, like you have to challenge that, right? And you can say like, okay, well, you say that you believe this one thing, but you did this other thing, like you did this behavior. So kind of help me understand how those two things can coexist, right?
Yeah,
and how we can challenge that in a positive and meaningful way to that person, right? Like, 'cause as you said, like, it's not, I don't need to change my behavior until it matters to me.
Exactly right. And maybe it's worth sort of describing for people what we mean by cognitive dissonance, just in case it's not really understood. I think it isn't very well understood. So the Twitter-sized explanation is that dissonance is basically just a lack of harmony, right? It's an effect that means that we can have opposing ideas or beliefs, and that the existence of that mental opposition creates psychological discomfort for us. And so you have just challenged my behavior that was being based on bias. That is creating psychological discomfort for me because it goes against this idea that I have of myself as a good and well-intentioned person. And so this dissonance can show up in lots of ways. And if I believe that I am a good and well-intentioned person, and you've just told me that I've offended somebody, even though clearly I didn't intend to, I'm going to prioritize what I meant over what I actually did.
Right. And it's sort of like highlighting the difference between intent and impact.
Yes. And the moment that we prioritize intent over impact, again, that means that we are just shutting ourselves off from continuing to be a good and well-intentioned person.
Chris, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise and for your just really incredible explanations around bias and what we can do about it, and more importantly, why we should probably address some of these things. So I just want to really give you a huge thanks for coming on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure. I love it. I'm sorry that it has to end.
Well, I mean, we could talk about this stuff all day because, again, if people want to start looking into the different types of bias and different examples of biases, there's so many there that we do them all the time, every single day. And we've mentioned it a couple of times, but the Daniel Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow, it's a really good place to start. I'll put a link to it in the episode description. But Chris, if people want to find you and quiz you about bias, where's the best place for people to get hold of you?
So I'm also on Twitter at the C Garrison. You can find me on Instagram, although I don't really do work-related stuff on Instagram. And like you, I've recently joined Threads and don't really know what I'm doing. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn as well. My organization is called Culturgen, which is a real word, by the way. It stands for a genetic artifact or characteristic that can be passed from one generation to the next. Which I think is, that when it comes to educating people about this kind of stuff, biases can often get passed from one generation to the next if we're not careful about it. So, lots of ways to find me. And I would love to hear from anybody if they have questions about this. I'm more than happy to nerd out about bias.
Cool. And as usual, we'll put all of your details in the episode description. So if you're listening and you want to get in touch with Chris, just have a look in the episode description and get in touch. But we'd love to hear your comments, your thoughts, your ideas around cognitive biases, unconscious bias. What do you think about it? Get in touch at 80percentmental.com, where you can subscribe and listen to all of our other episodes. You can follow us on Twitter at EPM Podcast or on Instagram at 80percentmental. And just last thing to do is to thank co-host Leah Washington.
Heyo. Absolutely.
I was going to say, was that it? Ayo.
No,
Thanks, Lisa.
Oh, new name. No, this is a really great conversation. And this is something that I talk about with my students all the time as they kind of like go off into the world. I think it's like one of the things that's most important to like really think about and be self-reflective, whether they are going into a fitness profession or a medical profession or, a coach or whatever, that if we want to be in whatever field, if we want to be effective practitioners, we have to be self-reflective. And I think this is one of the most important ways that we can do that.
Awesome. Well, I would love our listeners to let us know what we think about the episode. But thank you, Leah, for showing up. And thanks once again to Chris Garrison.
Thank you all. Pleasure to be here.
And we will see you next time. Well, I won't see you though, will I? Because it's a podcast, isn't it?